As yet another Yemeni journalist is jailed for daring to question government policy, we look at mounting state interference across the region. Amid censorship and crackdowns, we ask, where does this leave media freedom? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Shuli Ghosh. Well, this week, a court in Sana'a sentenced Munir Mawari, a Washington-based Yemeni journalist and contributor to the weekly newspaper Al-Masdar, to 2 years in jail. He was accused of defaming the president. His crime? To describe the president's leadership style as a kind of weapon of mass destruction. But he's far from the only journalist to suffer persecution by the authorities. Recently, the organisation Reporters Without Borders published its latest Press Freedom Index and found countries in the Arab world had some of the worst records. Out of 175 countries, Yemen ranks 167. 4 media personnel have been imprisoned this year alone. Journalists are banned from the troubled north, where government troops are engaged in clashes with Shia rebels. And those who try to report on the war risk being accused of collaborating with the rebellion. And since fighting broke out in the south, there's been a total news blackout on all military operations. Tunisia is ranked 154th in the list. Its media is largely under state control. President Ben Ali, who's been in office since 1987, was recently re-elected with nearly 90% of the vote. Before the election, he threatened that the law would be brought to bear on his detractors. Since then, at least one journalist has been arrested and another beaten, allegedly by plainclothes police. Egypt's ranked 143, with 2 journalists in prison this year. Since taking power, President Hosni Mubarak has tightened his grip on press freedom. The Egyptian government owns 99% of news outlets. It's also arrested numerous bloggers for online work, resulting in Egypt being classified as an internet enemy by Reporters Without Borders. Morocco is ranked 127. Morocco was once considered a role model for press freedom with a wealth of independent media. But recently a crackdown has escalated. At least 6 media workers have recently been imprisoned for publishing articles about the King's health and other royal family members. And newspapers have received fines of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Well, here to discuss the issue are my guests today. In New York, Mohammed Abdel Dayem, Middle East and North Africa Programme Coordinator at the Committee to Protect Journalists, the CPJ. In Sana'a, Mohammed al-Qadhi, a correspondent at the national newspaper. And in Cairo, Isandra El Amrani, a Moroccan-American writer on the Middle East and a blogger. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. Mohammed, in Yemen, let's start with you. Tell us about the situation in Yemen, because we know that several newspapers have been censored in recent weeks, accused of criticising the government's war on the Houthi rebels.
Yes, definitely. I mean, the situation is worsening in terms of press freedom. Yemen has been considered for the last few years by the international community as the beacon of democracy in the region, but this beacon is falling down, and press freedom is backsliding. You know, this year the government has suspended around 8 newspapers, and then they have been publishing again, but there is some kind of censorship. The government for the first time is trying to read what is there in the articles before allowing the newspapers go to printing press.
And how is the government justifying that? Why does the government say it needs to do that?
They are justifying that because, you know, these newspapers have been suspended, and one of them is still closed because they said that these have been inciting separation, supporting calls for independence in the south, and they have working against the unity of the country. This is the allegations put forward by the government. Yemen, you know, is living some kind of, we have a civil war in the north between al-Houthis and the government. Fighting is going on for more than 2 months now, or you can say 3 months. And there is some kind of growing momentum of protests in the south, asking, demanding for independence and separation again. So the government is trying to justify these harsh attacks against journalists by the so-called protection of the unity of the country.
Mohammed, in New York, I know this is a case that your organisation has been following closely. Is there any merit in the accusation that total press freedom could actually affect the security of the country or promote rebellion?
Absolutely not. And in fact, I would argue that the government's actions and the government's behavior is at the root of all this. I have to agree with my colleague over in Sana'a. 2009 has probably been the worst year for press freedom in Yemen since 1990. And so the government can make all kinds of excuses, but at the end of the day, these journalists are just reporting the news as it takes place. If the government bombs, as it has, civilians who are fleeing a battle scene and reporters report on that, and then they get kidnapped by the government, I'm not sure how it's, you know, the reporters that are affecting national unity in a negative way. I would argue it's the government's actions and then the bombarding of civilians that's doing that.
And of course, the knock-on effect is that ordinary people in Yemen do not have a clear idea of what's happening and cannot access total information about what's going on in their own country.
Well, thankfully they can do that through Al Jazeera and through other international news outlets, and as a result of that, we also see a campaign in Yemen that has been going on for months now, that is aimed at vilifying, especially Al Jazeera, but other international outlets as well. Basically, those outlets that the Yemeni government cannot control and cannot pressure the way they do with local newspapers.
Isander, it's not just Yemen, of course. We've seen a crackdown on press freedom in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Egypt, where you are. What's going on?
Well, in all of these countries, we're seeing, you know, not just journalists being arrested, but actually a whole range of measures being taken against journalists. In Morocco, we've had arrests, but also huge libel fines, much more than the law actually stipulates can be possible. You know, being handed out basically to cripple emerging free press. In Tunisia, you have routine intimidation of journalists. In Egypt, which in some respects is doing better than those countries, you still have laws in the books that, for instance, would send, in a libel case, would allow a prison sentence for journalists. So it's really a range of tools, some legal, some illegal, that are being used against reporters. Morocco
is an interesting case, isn't it? Because initially there was more media freedom and the independent press flourished. Why did that change?
Well, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. 10 years ago, Morocco was really a model for the rest of the region to follow. You had, after years of repression under the reign of Hassan II, by the end of his reign and the beginning of the current king, Mohammed VI, you did have a flourishing of the press taking place, a lot more, a huge range of opinions being expressed. But this honeymoon, if you want, lasted really a short time, and what you've seen over the last 2 years, actually in Morocco, it's not only against journalists. I mean, lately, of course, in the past month or two, it has been sentences against journalists who are reporting on speculations on the king's health. But before that, you had people being prosecuted for writing about the royal family on Facebook. You had bloggers prosecuted and sent to jail for writing about the king's tours around the country. And even when these people, the shocking thing is that even when these journalists or bloggers are not saying anything negative, sometimes they're being taken to court, or magazines are being seized.
Well, this issue about talking about the king's health, that's, to someone who's outside the country, seems a very spurious reason to charge anyone with a criminal act.
Absolutely. In fact, it has you know, one immediately thinks it's going to have the reverse effect. If one journalist is speculating about the king's health and nothing happens, well, then people will think it's speculation. But if there's an actual reaction from the government, then people are going to think, oh, hold on a minute, is there something going on here? The laws in Morocco make it very difficult, basically, to report on the activities of the king and the royal family. He is the head of state, so one would think it would be legitimate to criticize some of his decisions. But it's basically very, very difficult actually to know where the red line is, and that's a red line that a lot of journalists have crossed even without wanting to in the last few years in Morocco.
Mohammed, in Yemen, do you feel the same, that sometimes it's difficult to see where that red line is? I mean, do you feel as a journalist in Yemen yourself that your position as a journalist is much more difficult?
Yes, definitely. I mean, it's not only in terms of press freedom and the scope of freedom you have. This is a real challenge, a genuine problem for, I think, Arab journalists at large. But, you know, sometimes also as a journalist, you feel that there is a limited access to information. For example, you have mentioned here that, you know, there have been fighting going on for 6 years, and nobody has been able to go to, for example, the battlefield in Saada and Harf Sufyan. I managed, you know, the beginning of last month to sneak into the Harf Sufyan where the fighting is going on, but it was a kind of a risky and adventurous trip, and I could have, you know, I managed to reach the last point where the fighting is going on, and the last military post in that area. But, you know, I found myself that I was about to be arrested and jailed unless I found somebody who knew me in that spot, and he managed to take me out from that place. So it's a very risky situation.
Yeah, you're very brave to do that, knowing what the situation could be. You're very brave to do that, knowing what the consequences could be. Do you think other journalists would self-censor or not go all out to get the story because of the possible consequences?
It depends on the journalists themselves. You know, sometimes, you know, journalists, they try, I mean, to sneak to these areas, but they are arrested and they are taken by the security forces. It's not only a matter of harassment we are facing from the government. Sometimes, you know, the government, they can tolerate some articles here or there, and but, you know, you have also the problem of writing, for example, about religious leaders. You have also the problem of writing about tribal sheikhs and influential tribal figures and businessmen. So it's not only, I mean, the government. The threats are coming from different fronts.
Mohammed, in New York, how closely is the situation with various governments and press freedom in various countries in this region being watched by the West, by international organizations?
Well, we here at the Committee to Protect Journalists, at least in my department, in the Middle East department, we obviously follow all the countries of the region, and it is a challenging task by all means. You, in your introduction, mentioned all the horrible things that are taking place, you know, from Morocco all the way to Yemen, and you know, you didn't mention Iran. The things in Iran are pretty bad for journalists these days, and so we're a little bit overwhelmed. There's a lot going on in this region. If you look at the region as a whole, it is undoubtedly the worst place to be a journalist if you compare it to other regions of the world. There are some countries that are better off than others. Like Isander mentioned earlier, Egypt is doing a little better than some of these countries, but not by a whole lot. And so we're trying to cover all of it, but it can be pretty challenging at times.
OK, well, let's see what pressure the US could bring to bear. The Committee to Protect Journalists, Mohammed's organisation, sent a letter to the US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who was visiting Morocco this week, to ask for US pressure on Rabat to stop its violations against freedom of expression in the host country. The CPJ wrote, "We'd like to bring to your attention a sharp spike in government repression in the host country, Morocco. An aggressive crackdown on independent news outlets and journalists has occurred over the last 5 months and has included judicial harassment, politicised prosecutions, obstruction and censorship." Mohammed, in New York, Hillary Clinton's possibly not likely to bring up this issue, but is there more that countries like the US could be doing?
Yes, absolutely. And what's most alarming in the case of Morocco, and this is precisely why we wrote Secretary Clinton, is not so much that the government is using the law to come after journalists, which is unfortunately nothing new for Morocco or any of the countries of the region. What's really alarming in the past 5 or 6 months or so in Morocco is that the government is actually circumventing the law. to go after those journalists. So they're actually doing things that that are in contradiction to the letter and the spirit of the law. And so, for instance, they have the Moroccan authorities have shut down a newspaper, Al-Jarida al-Ula, a popular daily. And if you look at the relevant provisions in the law, the Ministry of Interior actually has no authority to shut down the newspaper. The most they could do is suspend the one issue that carried offensive material. Instead, they shut down the newspaper altogether. They're now investigating the managing editor and the supposedly offending cartoonist, and they've sealed the offices entirely. These journalists have no access to their offices, and the newspaper has not gone to print for almost 2 weeks now.
Isander, what do you think? Does the West do enough to put pressure on other countries? And in fact, things like Mohammed there was talking about the closing of newspapers, the trying of editors in countries like Morocco. Do they have enough repercussions outside their own country?
Well, unfortunately, I think as it stands, although you have seen solidarity campaigns and, of course, groups like CPJ and others doing advocacy work, to bring attention to the public. But I mean, generally speaking, this isn't really a high-profile issue in the Western agenda in the region. If you look at, for instance, the relationship between the US or the EU and Morocco, you have a huge aid relationship. Morocco having qualified for the Millennium Challenge account, it's about $800 million, about as much money being given by the EU in recent years. The thing is that these relationships, in theory, there's always in the treaties that are signed, in the agreements that are signed, there's always a reference to human rights, to freedom of the press, and so on. I think what we should be asking for is that these countries, these Western countries, at least respect the agreements that they've signed and do bring up these issues, whether they do so in public or in private. There's a debate over which way is the best way to go. By the end of the day, this is an internal Moroccan debate, and it's about a series of issues. It's about the way the security services behave, and like Mohammed in New York just said, the fact that the Interior Ministry has gone beyond the letter of the law to close down a newspaper is extremely worrying. What does it say? Never mind press freedom. What does it say about the rule of law in Morocco? And then the other issue is that there's a press code that needs to be revised. The government has threatened to revise it in a way that sounds like it will make it worse for journalists, not better. Journalists in trying to lobby for these changes do need, I think, the support of their colleagues abroad.
Mohammed, in Yemen, there has been some progress in some countries. I mean, Kuwait is seen as having a freer press out of all the Gulf countries. And of course, here in Qatar, we've got Al Jazeera English. Do those things encourage you?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, at least there's some kind of light shining there. I mean, in some of the Arab countries. But what is not what discouraging me here is that the government is trying. The president has pledged, several years ago to abolish the jail sentence on journalists. But the government has made worse. I mean, in its amendments to the law, there is also another draft that is now being debated. It's still in the parliament. It has not been discussed by the parliament, which is on access to information. There have been a lot of restrictions put on this draft that has been presented by one of the parliamentarians. The government is also trying to draft another law on trying to restrict also the use of the internet, because the use of the websites right now, they are not governed by any law. The government also promised, I mean, here in Yemen to allow the ownership, freedom of the broadcast media, but it is just only stuck promises. So these are also depressing for me, because the situation here in Yemen was much better several years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting that there does seem to have been a decline in some countries. Mohammed, in New York, is that the overall impression that the CPJ has, that there has been more restrictions introduced across the region?
There has definitely been an overall decline throughout the region, and it's more pronounced in some countries than in others, but the overall trajectory, frankly, can't be missed. Nonetheless, I'm actually quite optimistic because I think with satellite television, with Al Jazeera and other similar outfits, and with really an explosion in internet penetration in the region and the phenomenon of journalistic style blogging, the type of thing that Isunder does in Cairo and that thousands of colleagues do throughout the region, have really challenged the decades-long monopoly that all these governments used to have over the means of communication.
But that issue of blogging, Mohammed, is really worrying governments, isn't it? Because there has been a huge crackdown and many arrests of bloggers. I mean, you mentioned Iran. Bloggers have been detained in Iran quite a lot recently, following the post-election riots. So blogging is a particular concern to governments.
Absolutely, and bloggers are worrying to governments for a number of reasons. The governments are not able to put pressure on a newspaper or on a media organization to silence a specific journalist. Bloggers are essentially accountable to themselves and to their own sort of ethical and moral code, as it were. And this has been a problem for Tehran, it has been a problem for Cairo, and it has been a problem for many others, and it's not going to go away. Governments for a very long time used to be able to leverage licensing regimes and access to broadcast equipment and access to the printing press, the government-owned printing presses, to in fact restrict the means of communications. Well, today in the age of blogging, all you need is an internet connection, and even if they cut off your internet connections, you just go to an internet cafe, or you even steal somebody's wireless connection and you post. It's much more difficult to silence a blogger who is determined to write a journalistic story, who's determined to write an investigative report.
Isunder, in Egypt, of course, we've had the case of Karim Amma, who's been held since 2006. Are bloggers the new target?
Well, bloggers are the new target to some extent, and it depends from country to country. But just to pick up on something that Mohammed said, yes, bloggers have, and the internet, I think, has enabled a lot more freedom of expression. It's a very cheap way to publish and to reach a quite wide audience. But I don't think that we should, I'm a blogger myself and I like the medium, but I don't think that we should get ahead of the deeper problem in the Middle East. There may have been an improvement, since the 90s, when press freedom was extremely restricted in the region, but there hasn't been that much of an improvement. If you look at a country like Egypt, and I think most countries around the region, there is no freedom to broadcast. It is basically impossible to obtain a license for a TV station or a radio station that is privately owned. In Morocco, it is possible, but it is difficult, and it is a politicized process. The internet, at the end of the day, still reaches a limited amount of people. In the Gulf, it's quite a high percentage because you have mostly countries with small populations that are quite wealthy. But if you look at a country like Egypt, for instance, it's no higher than 15% of the population that has access to the internet. So blogs are good, but they're not everything.
Okay, gentlemen, it's been an interesting discussion, but we've run out of time. Thank you so much indeed for all your comments there. Mohammed Abdel Dayam in New York, Mohammed al-Qadhi and Isunder el-Amrani. And thank you for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We do welcome your comments and suggestions. Do email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. But for the moment, from me, Shuli Ghosh, bye-bye.